Milgram's research and situational variables. So this is going to look at the obedience that is investigated by Milgram and explanations of obedience, so situational variables affecting obedience, including proximity, location and uniform, again investigated by Milgram. So Milgram's research was to see how far people would go in obeying an authority figure. So volunteers were recruited for a lab experiment where they believed they were investigating learning, and the participants were 40 males aged between 20 and 50. At the beginning of the experiment, they were introduced to another participant, Mr. Wallace, who was a Confederate. The Confederate was the learner, and the teacher was always played by the participant. So the Confederate would always take on the role of the learner, and the naive participant would always take on the role of the teacher. There was also an experimenter who was dressed in a lab coat, which was played by an actor not by Milgram himself. The learner was strapped to the chair in another room, and it had electrodes where he would be given an electric shock if he gave an incorrect answer. After he'd learned a list of word pairs for him to learn, the teacher would test him on that word and asking the learner to recall the correct pair out of 4 possible choices. The teacher was told to administer an electric shock every time the learner made a mistake, and that increased in level each time. There were 30 switches on the electric shock generator, and it ranged from 50 volts to 450 volts, which was severe shock. The learner gave mainly incorrect answers on purpose, and for each of these the teachers had to administer an electric shock. The shock machine went up in 15 volts each time. There was only one true electric shock that was given at the start of the experiment when the naive participant was given an electric shock, and they had to judge what they thought that shock, the level of that shock was. So the findings were that all participants gave at least 300 volts, 65% administered a 450 volts, so the maximum voltage. They showed distress throughout. Some of them looked quite agitated, concerned and distressed in having to administer an electric shock. So they concluded that ordinary people are likely to follow orders given by an authority figure, even to the extent of killing an innocent human being. So 450 volts they knew could be potentially dangerous. Participants were debriefed at the end, and 84% of them said that they were glad they had taken part in the study. So briefly outline one research study into obedience for 6 marks. So this would be your aims, procedures, findings and conclusions of Milgram's research. Briefly describe what research into obedience has shown. So this is what it has shown, so just the findings and conclusions of Milgram's research. So that 65% gave 450 volts, at least all of them went up to 300 volts. Therefore people are willing to willing to obey an authority figure, even if it may cause severe harm or even death to an innocent person. So the variations then. So to help you to try and remember the 3 variations of proximity, uniform and location, the acronym of PULL. So P, proximity. So there's 2 ways in which the proximity was altered. So there was proximity to the authority figure. When the authority figure was distant, it was easier to resist the orders that they gave when they weren't close by. When the experimenters were instructed by a telephone from another room, obedience rates decreased to 20%, around about 20%, 21%. Proximity to the victim. In the original study, the teacher and learner were in separate rooms, but in a variation, they were seated in the same room, and again, obedience decreased. It was because the teacher could experience the pain that was being inflicted on the learner directly. Uniform. So in Milgram's original study, they wore a lab coat, a symbol of scientific expertise and authority. It gave him higher status. When the experiment was dressed in everyday clothes, obedience rates also decreased. So the uniform of the authority figure gave them higher status and therefore legitimised their orders. So in everyday clothes, obedience dropped to 20%. Location. So again, originally, the experiment was conducted at Yale University, which is a prestigious university in America. When Milgram's study was conducted in a rundown office in a city, obedience levels dropped. So again, it dropped to 47.5%. So it dropped from 65% down to 47.5%. So it suggests that the prestige of the Yale University increased obedience rates because it gave it that higher status. So, identify 2 factors that have been shown to affect obedience to authority. Briefly discuss how each of these factors affects obedience to authority. So, 2 marks for your identification, so it could be either proximity, uniform, or location, and then your 4 marks come from explaining how they affect obedience to authority. So if we're to evaluate it, so it's quite difficult to generalise the findings because the sample is unrepresentative. It lacks population validity. It was androcentric, only carried out on males, and it was ethnocentric, only done in America. So therefore it lacks, it's culturally biased and it's gender biased. It might be able to help explain Nazi Germany, so why people committed the crimes they did in Nazi Germany. So it could be through graduated commitment. So because in Milgram's original experiment they weren't asked to deliver 450 volts, they were asked to deliver 15 volts, and it gradually increased by 15 volts each time. So the foot in the door technique, they had committed to a lower level and then gradually that had increased over time. It was a lab experiment, therefore high control of extraneous variable, which increases the validity of results, therefore meaning we can establish cause and effect. It also has historical validity, temporal validity. So when it was Blass carried out a statistical analysis of all Milgram's obedience experiments and studies conducted by other researchers between 1961 and 1985. Later studies found no more or less of obedience than the original study, so it appears to have temporal validity. It will still hold true today. Ethical issues. Milgram deceived his participants by telling them that they were in a study about learning and punishment. Also, participants became very distressed and were encouraged to carry on with the experiment even when they asked not to. So in terms of evaluation-based questions, outline research into the effects of situational variables on obedience and discuss what this tells us about why people obey. So that would be your uniform, proximity and location. Describe and evaluate Milgram's research and explain 2 criticisms of Milgram's research for 6 marks. So 3 marks on one, 3 marks on the other.